So yeah, this is the focus of chapter 2, and I really just at first want to acknowledge my co-author here, Julie Sir-Pierce with the BLM, who also contributed to this chapter. And at the outset, I just want to say that the topic of human dimensions of sagebrush covers a really wide spectrum of issues and topics, and so this chapter definitely does not do justice to that full spectrum, and neither will this presentation. So hate to lower expectations at the outset here, but I think that's the reality. So next slide, please. So what are human dimensions? I think there are a lot of questions about what human dimensions are when it comes to natural resources and thinking about human dimensions. And so oftentimes there's a lot of questions about what is involved and goes into research that includes human dimensions. So next slide, please. So I think this figure does a nice job of trying to capture this really broad spectrum of the social sciences or the human dimensions that was created by Bennet et al. 2017. No relationship to me, that different Bennet there. And so the social sciences include the classic social science disciplines that we think about: sociology, anthropology, economics, but also some applied social science disciplines like law, education, communication studies, things like that. And so those different social science disciplines are applied, the theories, methods, and different types of tools and techniques are applied to study different types of social phenomena, social processes, and also individuals' attributes. So they can be used to study markets, how social norms are established and created, how decisions are made both by individuals and organizations, as well as the values and beliefs, perceptions, preferences, behaviors of individuals or stakeholders as they relate to natural resources. So I think you can see that this is a very broad spectrum that includes lots of different types of studies and analyses. And as I mentioned before, the focus of this chapter was really framed around an ecosystem services lens. So we just took a very small slice of different types of human dimensions type research to focus the narrative here. And that'll largely be the focus of this presentation. But if anybody is interested about the broader spectrum of the social sciences and how that might relate to sagebrush conservation and management, please feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to have a separate offline conversation with you going forward. Next slide, please. So any discussion about human dimensions, I think, should really be grounded in really thinking about the traditional and cultural uses, especially from the native cultures that have been here for millennia and have occupied, used, and benefited from sagebrush environments. So I think it's really important to recognize that history that's there. One study documented over 216 traditional uses of sagebrush, and those go to range from instrumental uses like the creation of rope and sandals and things like that, to spiritual and cultural practices like in ceremonial uses like the burning of sage for some of those ceremonial practices. So, so there's a broad range of uses that oftentimes we don't think about, but native cultures have relied on for a long period of time. Wildlife has also been really important for subsistence food sources, especially during different seasons. Everything from bison to elk, pronghorn, deer have been a longstanding use, a cultural use and subsistence food source going back thousands of years. Starting in about 400 years ago, livestock also were introduced into the sagebrush biome and have become adopted into traditional and cultural practices, especially sheep in different parts of the sagebrush biome. That has both transformed and shaped the native or the natural condition of the sagebrush biome, but has also helped shape the cultures that have occupied those landscapes, even prior to European settlement from European ancestors. So I think this cultural setting and grounding is really important to keep in mind, and I think there's lots of lessons that can be learned from the traditional uses of sagebrush. Next slide, please. And so thinking about the ecosystem services, and as I mentioned, this chapter is largely framed through an ecosystem services lens. I think taking an ecosystem service perspective can be really valuable. And for those that aren't familiar with the term ecosystem services, it's really the idea that different natural processes benefit human well-being in lots of different ways. And I think the power or the benefit to framing in an ecosystem services lens, it can really help to broaden the stakeholder groups that are connected and making the case that there are lots of different stakeholders that have a vested interest in the health and conservation and management of sagebrush going forward. So I'll highlight several specific ecosystem services and the different stakeholder groups that are connected to those here going forward. Next slide, please. But for those that are not familiar with ecosystem services, they're often categorized across four broad groupings. They include regulating services, so everything from how water infiltrates into the ground and soil, to mitigating flood impacts, to carbon sequestration, and wildfire resistance. There's also provisioning services that includes things like livestock production, beef, leather, wool, or livestock products. And then there's also water for both municipal and industrial uses as well as irrigation. And as also previously mentioned, the provision of food sources from wildlife that live in sagebrush environments. Oftentimes we forget about cultural ecosystem services, but in many cases this might be one of the most important and most critical to different stakeholders that are out there. So there's different spiritual benefits that are important for cultural practices, but also the sense of place and can really be an important contribution to human well-being as well. Recreation is also grouped into cultural services, and I'll highlight that here in just a little bit about how that's really been important to the future of sagebrush areas. And lastly, there are supporting services, which I like to think of these as the services that are in the background, the production of grasses, nutrient cycling, and things like that. Next slide, please. So just to highlight a handful of ecosystem services, I'll highlight several of them here going forward. But I think one of the interesting ones to highlight that I think can make the case that there's a much broader stakeholder group that have a vested interest in the future of the sagebrush biome. And so watershed services or hydrologic services are one of those services that I think can make this really explicit. On the map here, you can see the source watershed for the drinking water, the municipal and industrial water supply for Los Angeles, California, which supplies right about 4 million people with their drinking water. And you can see that even though it's on the coast far away from the sagebrush environment, that the source watershed covers large areas of sagebrush-dominated ecosystems. Next slide, please. Yeah, or bullet. So the drinking water supplies can be really critical, and so the ongoing management and sustainability of these areas and mitigating impacts like wildfire that could impact infrastructure for drinking water or irrigation supplies can be really important to think about. There's other large municipal areas like San Diego and Las Vegas that also have very similar footprints or where their source water is coming from, even though they might be located far from where those environments are at. Similarly, the irrigation supply for important agricultural areas may lie outside of the sagebrush biome, but the water that they're receiving, their source watersheds include large areas of sagebrush. So we can think about areas of the Great Plains as well as the Intermountain West where this is the case. And so again, I think that being able to make these connections with the different constituencies, stakeholder groups that may not think about the health of sagebrush, an ecosystem services lens can make these connections more explicit. Next slide, please. Also, climate stabilization can be is an important ecosystem service provided by sagebrush, and that's usually or predominantly through the soil carbon, the below ground carbon stores within these environments. Next slide. And this is a figure that was published in 2018 that looked at 22 different mitigation strategies for mitigating climate change. And they looked at natural solutions in particular. And next slide, I'm going to highlight one here. It's a busy graph, but the avoided conversion of grasslands or shrublands was the third most, held the third most potential for mitigating climate change going forward. And although this analysis included areas beyond sagebrush, also grassland areas, sagebrush was included within this category. And so it was largely, keeping these areas intact and healthy was considered a very important strategy for mitigating climate change, which we often don't think about. So limiting development, preventing impacts from disturbances like wildfire can be an important climate change mitigation strategy going forward. Next slide, please. And a human dimensions perspective can help think about the different strategies that can be implemented to help with mitigation, climate change mitigation. This was a study, a study by Cook and Ma from 2014 that was a survey of over 400 ranchers in Utah that asked about the importance or openness, willingness to implement different practices that would benefit climate change, mitigate against climate change. And so when asked about what was most important to them as influencing their decisions to adopt these different practices, they asked about things like wildlife habitat, soil quality, forage quality, and increased water storage and filtration. And those sorts of rationales or ecosystem services that would benefit from these practices were considered really important. And so you see the gradient here going from the dark being not important over to the right, and this figure being the most important. Those types of reasons were the most important for these ranchers. Next slide, please. Whereas if we look at things like providing incentive payments or tax benefits, those were much less compelling reasons to adopt these different types of practices, which might be counterintuitive to many of us that might think about the economic implications as being the most important, but really as these other ecosystem services that were the most compelling to these ranchers. So I think a human dimensions perspective can really bring to light the different motivations and the importance of different practices to different stakeholder groups, and in this case, practices that benefit climate change mitigation. Next slide. And as previously mentioned, livestock production is really a critical ecosystem service that comes from the sagebrush landscape. And while in terms of economic terms, tend to be rather small relative to different types of other industries like energy production and even recreation in some areas, livestock is absolutely critical, or agriculture is absolutely critical to many communities in the West and across the sagebrush biome. And so I think an ecosystem service perspective can be valuable to think about how the health of the sagebrush can also benefit livestock production and agriculture while simultaneously benefiting things like wildlife and the healthy functioning of the environment. And I think this is really brought home by the message that has been promoted by the Sage Grouse Initiative, benefiting the bird and the herd, and other spin-off messages from this, that makes it really explicit that those are not, that there can be compatibility between these different goals and motivations going forward. And the other point I'll just make about livestock production, we often think about it in terms of economics and the economies that underpin livestock production, but the cultural practices here, the history and the culture of ranching is also important, and oftentimes is more important to the ranchers themselves than the economics. And so maintaining those cultural practices and that lifestyle is something that should also be recognized, and has been brought to light by different types of human dimension studies. Next slide.
And Drew, we have just a couple of minutes in your presentation.
Sure. So wildfire resistance is another really critical ecosystem service. So mitigating against invasives, so maintaining healthy environments that are resistant to wildfire can help maintain the health and safety of people as well as reduced fire costs. Next slide. Recreation has grown in importance and is really important for many different types of economies. But there's a trade-off in conflicts with different types of recreational groups that is important to consider as well as we think about ecosystem services that come from recreation. And a human dimensions perspective, I think, can really help bring those to light. And I'm going to skip the public perceptions, the next one. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, and I'll just go ahead and skip this one as well. I'll conclude with this slide here. Many of you I saw that are participating in this morning's sessions participated in this study that we did that was funded through WAFLA of trying to identify the research needs that are out there relating to human dimensions or social sciences. And I include the link here if folks are interested in this report that we released in September. Be happy to follow up with others that are interested in discussing this further. But I think that thinking about the human dimensions are really limited. There hasn't been as much attention paid to human dimensions as other types of studies that are out there, the physical sciences and ecological sciences. And so I think this is really an area that deserves more attention, and would be happy to have discussions with folks that are interested in opportunities or needs that you see, but would also point you to this report as a resource for you in thinking about this. So with that, next slide, I'll conclude, and if we have time for questions, we'd be happy to take them, but also happy to take them directly offline. And thanks, sorry for going over, Susan, appreciate it.
Oh, you actually did not go over, and I was just leaving a little room for questions. So if we don't see a hand raised, I'm really happy to spin back to those couple of slides you passed by, Drew. So let's take just a pause here and see if we have any questions. I'm looking here. I don't see any hands up from attendees or questions submitted just at the moment. So if you would like to swing back, Drew, I'm happy to go back for you.
Make a couple of points on those slides I skipped through.
Here?
There, sure. I think one of the things that is valuable from a human dimensions perspective is really taking a pulse from a broader spectrum of stakeholders. So I don't want to throw our federal partners and federal agencies under the bus here, but this is a study that was published in 2011, but I believe the survey was conducted in 2009. So it's a little bit dated now, but they asked urban and rural residents in 3 different areas of the sagebrush biome a series of questions and asked them how much they agreed with these different questions. One was federal managers use public input to make decisions. The other one was federal managers effectively build trust and cooperation with local citizens. And if we come over to the column here underneath urban, you'll see that 20% of urban residents agreed with that first statement, only 17% agreed with the second statement. And in the rural column, 27% agreed with that first statement and 21 agreed with that second statement. And so the point here is not to sort of criticize our federal agencies or federal managers, but I think that a human dimensions perspective can bring to light different insights. Oftentimes I think we're in our own little silos and we have the usual suspects that are at the table in these discussions. And so using different techniques like surveys and other methods, we can get a broader spectrum of how messages are resonating and how we're connecting with these other types of stakeholder groups. And so I think public perceptions and really getting a gauge on those can be valuable. Human dimensions can help bring those to light. Well,
hey, Drew, we actually have a question here that was submitted. This is from Brett Branscombe. Other than Bundyville, what is your take on the status of human dimensions work in the area of human/government relations, and in parentheses, trust and sagebrush wars? Yeah,
that's an excellent question. I guess my take is that it's complex and it's probably a very nuanced answer and very, you get different responses and different answers in different places that you would conduct a study like this. So I think in some areas, land management agencies, both state and federal, have done a really great job. And I think there's some strong human dimensions that supports that. Of trying to build trust and connections. And I think that's really been an emphasis of these agencies over the last decade. But I think in other areas, there's still ways to go. And I think that there's still conflicts that are out there. And sometimes we're still fighting battles from decades ago. So it's a really complex issue. I can't speak to the specific example that you highlighted there, but I think a human dimensions perspective can help bring to light the tensions that are there, as well as opportunities for building larger coalitions and stakeholder buy-in.
Thanks, Drew. One more question, and then I will ask you to go ahead and wrap up. This one is, how are mineral resources considered in terms of ecosystem services?
That's a great question. I think oftentimes mineral resources are not, are sort of ignored or punted on in an ecosystem services lens. That's not always the case. But if we think about, it was an ecosystem service millions of years ago that created those resources, you can think of them that way. But oftentimes they're not really considered within that, an ecosystem services perspective, with the exception of maybe how they're mitigated or how restoration work might happen after extraction. But I think that there's a opportunity to think about those in a different way. Certainly, we didn't really address the energy issues and mining issues to a great deal in this chapter, but that obviously is the drivers of some economies, and especially today, it's a really critical one, and how the future of those communities will respond to changes in energy and minerals markets will be absolutely critical to the future of sagebrush areas. So yeah, I will defer to other folks that have more experience with that specific question, but it is one that's interesting one to think about how it's addressed in the ecosystem services lens.
Okay, well, thank you, Drew. Any final wrap-up comments then? And for folks that are observing the presentations, these will be posted. So that other slide about collaboration, Drew, I know there were some really interesting points on that. So would certainly encourage people to take a look at that one as well. And yeah, anything just by way of wrap-up?
Yeah, I think I'll just conclude again by underscoring the point that I think that there is a great deal of opportunity to more fully think about the human dimensions as it relates to sagebrush conservation and management. And I would be very open to having further discussions with folks to think about how we advance this work going forward. So thank you so much for your time this morning.
Very good. Thank you so much, Drew. Really appreciate your presentation.